how do the micro concerns of managing a corporation within a nation operate when you have a geopolitical backdrop which is as complicated and as troubling as we have today? Here to talk to us about that and maybe provide some insight is a long-term journalist, a man who's been looking at the geopolitical backdrop for probably more years than you'd care to mention, I would imagine. Let's invite to the stage contributing editor to The Economist, John Andrews.
Indeed, more years than I care to remember. This is my third visit to Islamabad, and it's a great pleasure to be here, but I should tell you that the second visit was in 1992, and the first visit was in 1973. So going back to the presentation this morning when Professor Atar-Rahman said that there's a potential for reversing age, I think I have a vested interest in hoping that all that comes true. Anyway, the geopolitical backdrop. The Chinese, as you know, have a curse, which is, may you live in interesting times. And I think the truth is that we live in very interesting times at the moment. We are most notably in what I could describe as the era of Trump. Now, who is Donald J. Trump? Well, a real estate tycoon and a TV star with a dangerously thin skin, a rather odd hairstyle, not that I can really talk, and a reckless approach to fact and fiction. And yet, the reality is that he is now the most powerful man in the world. His slogan, "Make America Great Again," you probably remember from his election campaign, and it struck a chord. But actually, it's an offense to logic, and it was peculiarly fatuous, because what's the point of that word again? America is already great. Whether you like it or loathe it, America is a great country. It has the biggest economy in the world, although on a purchasing power parity, China actually is slightly bigger now. And it certainly has the most powerful military in the world. Yet, we are where we are, as that rather trite American expression has it. And the threat now is a slide towards protectionism. You may remember that during the campaign, and actually since his election, Trump has talked about withdrawing, well, he has already signed the withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership with Asian countries in the Pacific. And he's threatening to rewrite NAFTA. And put up that sort of drift of protectionism at one side, you also have the feeling that what Trump is saying about the world in general, the military in particular, it's the end of what could be called the Pax Americana, the American-led and designed peace, which basically kept the world stable since the end of the Second World War. Now, if you take Trump at one thing, and then take the Brexit vote in my country, a vote with which I fundamentally disagree, maybe we're seeing also not just the end of this Pax Americana, but maybe the end of the European Union, which, only in 2012 won the Nobel Peace Prize for actually creating peace and stability in Europe for over 60 years. Now, take Trump, take Brexit, take the clever tactics of Vladimir Putin. Maybe NATO, too, is on the way out. NATO, the most successful military alliance in history. Take all of that, and then add the rise of Asia in general, and China in particular, and perhaps what we're seeing really is the end of what we in the West, but you in the East, have come to call the West. Well, way back in 1989, with the collapse of communism, Francis Fukuyama wrote an article in Foreign Affairs in which he famously proclaimed the end of history. In other words, it was the triumph of democracy, of capitalism, of liberal thought, the triumph of all that thinking that had come out of European and American universities, which were admired this morning by our speakers. Well, Fukuyama, as he now admits, was wrong. The Russia of Yeltsin was seen as a friend. The Russia of Vladimir Putin is at best seen as a rival by the West. And some would argue it's seen as an enemy. Well, what about China? Well, as for China, the People's Republic is an economic power, and it's now flexing its military muscles in a way that alarms many, if not most, of its Asian and Pacific partners. Well, what also of the Arab Spring, or the Arab Awakening, as some renamed it? That should have meant the triumph of liberal ideals. It should have confirmed the Fukuyama thesis of the end of history. Yet what is the reality now? What did it lead to? Mainly, in fact, of course, to chaos or tyranny. Libya is a failed state, just as Somalia is. Egypt is a dictatorship. Bear in mind, by the way, that Abdel Fattah al-Sisi got the first phone call from Donald J. Trump after his inauguration, and Sisi has just, of course, been received in the United States in a very friendly way by Donald Trump. Syria is now in its 6th year of civil war. Yemen is approaching its 3rd year of civil war, and the Sunni Muslim rulers of Bahrain have cowed their Shia majority citizens into a sort of morose surrender. In short, I don't think any of us should really look at the world through rose-colored spectacles. So what could possibly go wrong in this new Trumpian world where the man says everything will be terrific? I love that. I hate that gesture. Well, nuclear conflagration, whether by accident or design, is one obvious risk. It's more than a trifle worrying that much of America's nuclear preparedness actually rests upon floppy disks, which are no longer made and which I think none of us probably have ever kept. They're just thrown away now. It's more than a trifle worrying also that, as Britain's Sunday Times revealed earlier this year, a Trident missile, fortunately unarmed, went off course during a test. And it's pretty scary also that Trump, during his campaign, said that maybe Japan and South Korea should have nuclear weapons, as if the world, with 9 nuclear-armed powers and some 15,000 nuclear weapons, really needs any more such weapons of mass destruction. And here I'm not criticizing the Pakistan's possession of nuclear weapons. It seems to me that had a great deal of geopolitical sense. However, I think as a rule of thumb, the fewer nuclear weapons in the world, the better. Well, most worrying of all, if you take this sort of risk of nuclear conflagration, at least from a Western perspective, is Kim Jong-un in North Korea, an unpredictable dictator in a very dangerous neighborhood where China and Russia are also nuclear powers. Now, a bit like Donald J. Trump, Kim likes to be unpredictable, but his threat to wipe out Los Angeles is the kind of rhetoric which can't be entirely laughed off. And it does seem from his recent comments that Donald J. Trump, I think learning the presidential role on the job, has more or less come to the same conclusion. Now, will China calm all our fears about this? If you remember, today and tomorrow, Xi Jinping is actually in Trump's Florida residence, Mar-a-Lago, talking about these things. Now, on the plus side, Xi Jinping is another of the world's strongman leaders, like Trump, or like Turkey's Tayyip Erdogan, or like Erdogan, or like the Philippines' Rodrigo Duterte, or, of course, like Vladimir Putin. And Xi, strong men are supposed to be able to make things happen. Well, he told the World Economic Forum in Davos in January that protectionism is bad and free trade is good. Actually, the sort of thing that Trump seems no longer to believe in. And he also added that China has no wish to see North Korea provoking disaster and catastrophe. Well, that's possibly a positive sign from China. But what about the negative side? Now, rising powers all too often clash with bigger powers, with superpowers. 2,500 years ago, Thucydides wrote his History of the Peloponnesian War, 30 years of war between Sparta and Athens, when superpower Sparta objected to the rising power of Athens. Now, there's a Harvard political scientist called Graham Allison, and he's written of what he calls the Thucydides Trap. And what he means is he found there were 16 periods in the last 500 years in which an established power was confronted by a rising power. Now, in 12 of those instances, the result was war. One of the peaceful exceptions, I'm happy to say, was that Britain, then the superpower, did not go to war with rising America in the early 20th century. So the question now is, will the rise of China plunge the world into this Thucydides trap? Well, the People's Liberation Army, which is not just the army, but also includes the Navy and the Air Force, has 2.3 million people on the front line, and China is intent on controlling the South China Sea, as you see with its island building. And that, of course, is pieces of rock, pieces of sand, which are coveted or claimed by half a dozen other countries. But China is the mighty power and determined, it seems, to carry on regardless of the risk of conflict. Well, China, of course, has the idea of one belt, one road, a recreation of the old Silk Route between West and East by both land and sea. And, of course, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is part of this. I regard this as a very, very sensible, healthy, positive thing. But what is commercially and economically ambitious, and therefore, in theory, benefits everybody, could turn sour. What happens if the commercial and the political interests along these routes come into conflict? Well, China is spending hugely on its military, so that is possibly a danger of the Thucydides trap. But it's still going to take China until 2050 to match America's defense spending. Remember, America, supposedly not as great as Donald J. Trump would want it, accounts for more than 40% of the world's spending on defense and around 72% of NATO's spending. So basically, we shouldn't really, surely, panic. China always claims that it has no expansionist ambitions, and I think most people might well agree, although I suspect the Tibetans might well disagree. But more to the point, whatever China's military ambitions, it is still a long way behind the US in terms of technology. So there is actually, I think, no immediate threat of the Thucydides trap. But bear it in mind for the future. But I'm aware that I'm talking about this, I'm viewing this geopolitics through very much a Western prism. Now, a non-Western prism would give, I think, a very different view. Russia may have accepted the expansion of the European Union into what was once a Soviet zone, but when the West dangled the carrot of NATO membership to Ukraine and Georgia, that was simply a provocation. Now, as to the West's invasion of Afghanistan, to its invasion of Iraq, to its toppling of Gaddafi in Libya, to its involvement in Syria, Yemen, Somalia, or America's constant support for Israel willy-nilly, it's pretty easy to understand why so many in the Muslim world view Western policy as a war against Islam. And of course, it hardly helps when President Trump attempts to implement what amounts to a ban on Muslims visiting the United States. Now, is Trump's America therefore determined to bring about the so-called clash of civilizations that Samuel Huntington predicted back in 1993? Well, I sincerely hope not. But I think there is always a risk that something which starts as a very small feature with momentum, it becomes like a snowball, gets bigger and bigger, and becomes self-fulfilling. And it doesn't help, I think, that President Trump is proposing increasing America's defense budget by $54 billion, while at the same time demanding a 28% cut in the $50 billion or so that America spends on diplomacy and foreign aid. I feel rather sorry for the American ambassador who was here earlier today, David Hale, when he must see what's happening in the White House as almost insulting to his own profession. Now, given, I think, that soft power, not hard power, is what wins a country friends and influence, frankly, I despair of American policy so far under Mr. Trump. But is there any sense, actually, that the president's zeal for conventional military forces and conventional tactics, is there any sense that it is sensible? Well, I'd argue, actually, that a more likely threat is not, war by China or whatever. It's actually cyber war, and it's what's now called hybrid war, the kind that Putin has employed so brilliantly in Ukraine and in Crimea, and potentially that he may proclaim in the Baltic states. It's a mix of cyber warfare, propaganda, and soldiers wearing no identifying insignia. The reality, and let's hope that the Trump era of nationalism and protectionism doesn't change this, is that nowadays there are no more wars between states. I've just written a book on conflict, about wars, and the only war between states that I could find so far in this century was in 2008 between Russia and Georgia, and it lasted for all of 5 days. So war between states is the exception, not the rule. Now it's asymmetric warfare, and that's been around from the days of David and Goliath through the Vietnam War to Al-Qaeda. Wars these days involve non-state actors like Boko Haram in Nigeria or the Taliban in Afghanistan or various groups, of course, here in Pakistan. And these conflicts often cross frontiers. Whether they cross them or not, they are a danger to the established order. As Henry Kissinger once said, the conventional army loses if it doesn't win. The guerrilla wins if he does not lose. Well, a threat, therefore, in my opinion, the real threat is asymmetric warfare. Well, if you want to have one number that actually almost everybody in the world now can recognize, it's 9/11, September the 11th, 2001. It's engraved, certainly on the American consciousness, just like the death of John Fitzgerald Kennedy in 1963, or for those old enough to remember, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. Now, 9/11 really was the day that the world changed. From it, you had the invasion of Afghanistan, and then you had Iraq in George W. Bush's global war on terror. A really stupid phrase, but I'm afraid it stuck for some time. Now, given the state of both Afghanistan and Iraq today, this is surely a lesson for Donald Trump's America in being careful what you wish for. The reason is that 9/11, the attacks, came literally out of a blue, almost cloudless sky. But their origins, of course, go back much, much further, notably to the fight in the 1980s to eliminate the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. Now, that fight included a certain Osama bin Laden, one of the Mujahideen being financed by Saudi Arabia, the United States, and supported by Pakistan. Well, Mr. bin Laden has gone to meet his maker, killed by American Special Forces in 2011 with Barack Obama and his cabinet looking on via the miracle of satellite technology. Well, again, be careful what you wish for. Bin Laden turned against America because Saudi Arabia, the guardian of Islam's holiest cities, allowed American troops to be stationed in the kingdom before the first Gulf War in 1990, when an American-led coalition expelled Saddam Hussein's troops from Kuwait. Now, what followed was a series of al-Qaeda attacks on American interests from Kenya and Tanzania all the way eventually to the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Washington. Well, bin Laden has gone. But meanwhile, his successor of Al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri, is still with us and still threatening governments around the world. Now, does that really matter to us in the West? Well, arguably, it should matter more to you in the Muslim world, from Morocco to the southern Philippines. After all, the actions of Al-Qaeda, of ISIS, of Boko Haram, other extreme groups, they have killed many, many, many thousand more Muslims than non-Muslim Westerners. And statistically, for the West, when you compare deaths from terrorism with deaths from road accidents or disease, the threat is minimal. I'm going to quote The Economist from September last year. It said, quotes, even in 2001, okay, that's the 9/11 year, the likelihood of an American in the United States being killed in a terrorist attack was less than 1 in 100,000. In the decade up to 2013, that fell to 1 in 56 million. The chance of being the victim in 2013 of an ordinary homicide in the United States was 1 in 20,000. Now, why did The Economist write this? Because he goes on to say, Barack Obama was correct when he said last year, that's 2015, that the danger of drowning in a bathtub is greater than that of being killed by terrorists. Baths are a 1 in a million risk. Well, I don't know what the risk of being killed in a bathtub here or being killed in a terrorist attack here in Pakistan is, but my sympathies really do go out to those who were killed in Lahore yesterday. The thing about terrorism, of course, is that in a sense, the statistics don't matter. The idea of terror is to create a psychological impact. But put all those statistics aside. The flight from war or poverty in the Middle East and Africa is provoking a constant tide of migration to the prosperity and sanctuary, the relative stability of neighboring countries, and of course, in particular, the European Union. Last year, more than 1 million migrants and refugees managed to arrive in the EU, and some 4,000 died in the Mediterranean in the attempt. Now, that is one of the reasons why European politics these days is so fraught and why so much populism is in the electoral scene. You have Brexit in Britain, you have the risk that Marine Le Pen will become the next president of France. So it's not to be dismissed. But lest we Europeans feel that we are cursed with an unfair burden, we should actually remember that Turkey is host to around 2.8 million refugees from the wars in the Middle East, and in Lebanon, around 1/5 of the population now are Syrians who fled the civil war, a war that's displaced half of the country's population. And you, of course, in Pakistan, well, you're well aware of the repercussions of war. Over the past 4 decades, your country has been host to as many as 2.5 million Afghans seeking sanctuary. So despite the controversy over the present zeal by the government to repatriate many of these Afghans, one can see why it's there. Now, I talked of Al-Qaeda, but if Al-Qaeda is still with us, so actually is its child, Islamic State. During his election campaign, Donald Trump said he would, and I quote, forgive the language, he said, "We'll bomb the shit out of ISIS." Well, in his inauguration address in January, he was a little less vulgar. Quotes, "We will reinforce old alliances and form new ones, and unite the civilized world against radical Islamic terrorism, which we will eradicate completely from the face of the world." Well, I wish him luck. And I'm not sure whether, what he will mean in practice by old alliances and new ones. The reality is that America's military, or NATO's, could easily have defeated ISIS on the battlefield, but only at an absolutely unacceptable cost in civilian casualties, the so-called collateral damage. That is why it's taking so long to conquer Mosul and why Raqqa is not an easy task either. But the fact, of course, is that Islamic State, or Dawlat al-Islamiyya, is on the ropes, but its threat remains. And why does its threat remain? It's because its message can't be silenced by military defeat. Now, that message, in my opinion, has to be challenged and defeated from within the Muslim world itself. I'm going on slightly dodgy ground here, astaghfirullah, but I'm not a Muslim, so I don't want to preach to Muslims how you should react. But I do think this message has to be challenged, and it's got to be challenged from within. One reason that the message has proved so attractive and so powerful is that the doctrine and behavior of both Al-Qaeda and ISIS are so similar to those of Saudi Arabia and the Wahhabi practice of Islam. And that doctrine has been spread by Saudi petrodollars, witness all the mosques and madrasas throughout the Islamic world and also in Europe that are now preaching a form of Wahhabism, of Salafism. Now, I want to make clear, I don't want to conflate Wahhabism and Salafism with terrorism, but it's not a coincidence that 15 of the 19 hijackers of 9/11 were Saudi citizens, or that much of the funding for Al-Qaeda and Islamic State has come from private citizens, not the governments, in the kingdom and also in Wahhabi Qatar and also in non-Wahhabi United Arab Emirates. But the brilliance of ISIS has been its use of social media, and you have a problem because of that, which is going to haunt us for years to come, whether it's in traditionally moderate Malaysia, Morocco, or Indonesia, all the way to London or Paris or even the States. And meanwhile, you look at the Muslim world, and we have a sectarian war by proxy in both Syria and Yemen. You have Sunni Arab Saudi Arabia versus Shiite and Persian Iran. And that war is being complicated by the involvement in the region of America, Russia, Turkey, Israel. Well, will Saudi Arabia and Iran be reconciled, which is, I think, in the end, the only way that the sectarian tensions can be reduced? Well, it's not impossible. Remember that in the era of the Shah of Iran, the two were actually friends, and they have a mutual interest in the future of the international oil market. And Shia Muslims, whatever the declarations by Al-Qaeda and ISIS that they are heretics and apostates, are able, in their thousands, still to make the pilgrimage to Mecca. But what I feel is needed, and this is where it's more for you to say than for me to say, is I think there needs to be a willingness to reinterpret Islam to allow it to be at ease in the modern world, as it was in the glorious days of the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad or in the relaxed days of the Ottoman Empire. Now, I don't pretend to have any authority in these matters, but it does seem to me that the means exists to accomplish this, what could be called an Islamic Reformation. By that I mean ijtihad, to allow the independent interpretation of problems not explicitly covered by the Quran or the sayings of the Prophet. Tragically, in the 9th century, a majority of Muslim ulama declared that the Bab al-Ijtihad, the door of ijtihad, was closed. Well, I think, if you'll forgive me, that actually the Islamic world really does need to reopen that door. Well, will President Trump prove to be a helpful actor in either this or in the international scene? Well, frankly, I have my doubts. Now, optimists will look for a lowering of America's tensions with Russia. They'll argue that the demands and complexities of his new role will produce a more measured, less impulsive Donald J. Trump. Well, arguably so. At least he has accepted that healthcare reform was a lot more complex than he'd ever imagined. But I suspect that our hopes are actually going to be disappointed. I suspect we'll have to cope with 4 years, who knows, 8, I dread that thought, in which America turns inward. Now, whatever the many faults of American foreign policy, from the Vietnam War to its anti-democratic activism in Latin America, the lesson of history from the First World War to the Dayton Agreement in 1995 that finally brought peace to the Balkans, is that on balance, it's critical balance, we're better off with an America that engages with the outside world and spreads the soft power of democracy and liberal capitalism. Now, somehow, with a Trumpian America, I don't think that's very likely, and so I fear for my grandchildren's future. So, what next? Well, I've been pretty gloomy, so let me try and cheer you up with a few statistics to make you feel a touch better. I've been talking about the threat of war. Well, during the Second World War, the number of deaths per year from war ran at about 10 million each year. In the Cold War, from 1950 to 1989, it was down to 180,000 a year. And that, of course, embraced the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and so on. And then in the 1990s, when you had the Rwandan genocide, the death from war was only 100,000 a year. And then in this century, it's down to 55,000 a year. So, you know, maybe we're getting better. Now, the problem, of course, is that any death is a death too many, and I suspect that with or without President Trump, there will be more to come. As George Santayana once said, only the dead have seen the end of war. But let me quote a final remark, Abba Eban, who was an Israeli foreign minister, when he said, only peace is inevitable. And I do hope that peace comes to this region and that you all prosper and that you do become, within the 25th best performing economies, if not the 20th. Thank you very much.